have got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo, a fine form of February festival featuring facets of politics, art, debate and food. The Tories tanks in 2 by-elections this week, and another one looms in Rochdale. The town's Muslim population was measured at 36% in the census 3 years ago, so it can play a large part in the result. Today with my politics panel, I want to ask to what extent the Muslim vote shapes the politics of this country. And are the efforts of politicians like the dumped Labour candidate Azhar Ali to pick up those votes any different from my own bid a quarter of a century ago in Enfield Southgate, or that of Mrs Thatcher in neighbouring Finchley, to strike positions that would attract the votes of the Jewish community? More bad news for the Conservatives came in the form of an official recession. With GDP falling 0.3% in the final few months of last year, Britain endured 2 successive quarters of economic contraction. Rishi insists that his plan is working, but how much responsibility does he bear for the grim economic news? Ukrainian forces are on the back foot as they retreat from the eastern town of Avdiivka, where Russian forces threaten to surround them. If, as some analysts predict, other European countries will find themselves in a similar shooting match with Russia in the next decade, how would they fare? Max Jeffrey has just returned from Estonia, where he observed NATO forces taking part in military training exercises. He'll join me to discuss what he saw and found. And for the sting in the tail of the first hour of the programme, Stefan Kyriazis has been the busiest of bees this week, taking in 4 new theatrical productions, including a musical about Live Aid and the latest effort from star playwright Jez Butterworth. All of that to come, but first, your headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning. It's 11 o'clock. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands as he pushed Republicans to urgently pass more military aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. Former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine needs more support.
Loss of Avdiivka is significant. The Ukrainians have been holding on to that since 2014 and fighting the Russians. But they've made the sensible military decision not to sacrifice any more of their troops to keep this completely decimated piece of territory. The Russians are making some advances from a one-dimensional perspective on the front line, but these advances are tiny at the moment, and it's purely because Russia has got more ammunition from North Korea and from Iran. And the Ukrainians are suffering a shortage of ammunition coming from the West.
Meanwhile, more than 400 people have been detained across 32 Russian cities since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. It's the biggest wave of unrest since September 2022, when more than 1,300 were arrested for protesting against forced military service, part of President Putin's effort to cover heavy casualties endured in Ukraine. Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny. Meanwhile, authorities have been accused of doing everything they can to avoid handing over Mr. Navalny's body to his family. Yesterday, the 69-year-old mother of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic visited the remote penal colony where he died. She says she was told his body had been taken to a nearby morgue, but when she arrived there, she found it closed. Mr. Navalny's spokespeople claim his death was orchestrated murder by the Russian president. That's been rejected by the Kremlin. Political analyst and Russian exile Valery Morozov told GBNews it looks like revenge.
It was a payback for Navalny. And the people who were behind, they've just decided that, Putin has enough support, about 70, 80%. There is no problem. And just to get rid of Navalny, they've sent him from the prison, which was about 200 kilometers from Moscow to far north, and let him stay there and die.
Ukrainian refugees will be offered an 18-month visa extension to stay in the UK. It means Ukrainians who had to flee their home after Russia's invasion will be able to stay in Britain until at least September 2026. In other news, 2 ministers have written to police chiefs to express concerns over the safety of politicians amid increased protests. Security Minister Tom Tugendhat and Policing Minister Chris Philp took the unusual step after pro-Palestinian activists gathered outside the home of Tobias Ellwood. They say current laws allow for protesters to be directed away from residential areas, and they're encouraging police to make robust use of them. It comes as reports in the Daily Mail suggest Just Stop Oil activists are planning to occupy the homes of MPs, with one protester reportedly telling a journalist the group is ready to look a bit loony. The Foreign Secretary will visit the Falkland Islands amid calls in Argentina for talks on the future of the archipelago. Lord Cameron insists the sovereignty of the territory will not be up for discussion as he prepares for the first visit by a cabinet minister since 2016. Last month, Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, called for the islands to be handed over to his country, despite being under British rule since 1883. A vote in 2013 found almost all residents prefer to remain part of the United Kingdom. A violent riot erupted on the streets of The Hague last night after anti-government groups clashed with rival communities. What started as peaceful Eritrean community meetings last night ended in violence, with the police cars torched and objects thrown at officers. Video shared online showed groups of people setting fire to cars and engaging in violence. The Hague's mayor says an emergency order was issued and police presence has been increased. And for the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Michael.
Well, thank you, Sophia Wenslow. The Labour Party sailed to victory in the by-elections at Kingswood and Wellingborough this week, but they cannot win the upcoming by-election in Rochdale because it has disowned the candidate, Azhar Ali, over comments that he made about Israel. But was Ali lured into a rhetorical bidding match over the fraught Israel-Palestine conflict in order to win the support of Rochdale's large Muslim population? And if so, is that any different in character or effect for candidates to try to mollify such voters compared with the way that Mrs Thatcher and I tried to win votes in the Jewish community in our North London constituencies 25 years ago? To discuss the growing influence of Muslim British voters, I'm joined by Rakib Ehsan, author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Identity Politics, as well as by Reem Ibrahim, Communications Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Dennis McShane, who was the Labour MP for Rotherham. Rakib, may I start with you? And that question I've asked, is there anything qualitatively different in candidates now trying to get the Muslim vote from, what I was doing a quarter of a century ago, trying to get the Jewish vote in North London?
Well, I think that more generally, when looking at British politics, I think the influence of identity politics is too strong. But you were the MP for Enfield Southgate. Margaret Thatcher was MP for Finchley. And, of course, engaging with religious minorities in your constituency, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's more what is the nature of that engagement. But the reality is we're becoming an increasingly diverse society in terms of ethnicity and religion. So the impact of foreign conflicts, geopolitical tensions, that may well have an impact on the content of our national and local politics. But I have to say, the by-election in Rochdale, I think the build-up to it has been a crying shame, and I don't think it's a particularly positive representation of British democracy.
Why has it been a crying shame?
Well, I think that firstly you have Labour's issues with its former candidate, Azhar Ali. I think that while people naturally, they are entitled to have strong preferences in regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are serious domestic problems in Rochdale in terms of quality of public services, which are more domestic in nature, and I think they should be a greater focus when it comes to those campaigns up there.
But let me go back to my basic question.
Sure.
So 25 years ago, I became very concerned with Soviet Jewry issues, Jewish people trying to get out of the Soviet Union. I obviously tended to support Israel rather than the Palestinian cause because, you know, pushed in that direction by my constituents. I just want to know if people in the Rochdale by-election are tending to say that they're looking for a ceasefire, or if they were tending to say that, you know, that they're unhappy with what Israel is doing in Gaza. Is that any different? Is it any worse? Is it sinister in a way that it wasn't when I was appealing to my Jewish voters?
Well, I think that people are absolutely entitled to, for example, criticise the Israeli government's policies in terms of the militaristic occupation and population displacement of the Palestinian people. What I don't agree with is the peddling of conspiracy theories, which, in my view, can very much enter anti-Semitic territory. I think you could be deeply critical of the current Israeli government, which contains some very, how do you say, unsavoury characters, including Benjamin Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. You can do that without indulging in those conspiracy theories of a decidedly anti-Jewish nature. And
let's recall that the Labour candidate has been disowned for comments that went beyond the pale in the view of his own party. Reem, what do you think? Do you mind addressing the same issue? Is anything happening with the Muslim vote that hasn't happened with other votes before?
Well, I mean, we're looking at history with Tony Blair and Iraq, and we actually saw the Muslim vote decline as a result of, I think it halved after 2004. I think what's interesting about this particular issue is that Israel-Palestine seems to be the most pertinent political issue for Muslim voters. It does feel as though the Labour Party have sort of kind of underestimated the value of those voters in itself. I agree. I think there's nothing wrong with engaging with religious communities directly. I think it's actually a very positive thing. It really does show that the importance of community in itself. But the Labour Party clearly have underestimated the value of the Muslim vote to the party itself. And then, therefore, they've now also tried to retrospectively kind of combat the anti-Semitism problem they have had in the Labour Party, all of the accusations during Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader of the Labour Party, as well as during his time there with all of those accusations. So Keir Starmer's clearly tried to do it the other way and kind of overcompensated, whilst also meaning that he has kind of disenfranchised many of those Muslim Labour voters.
But let's think about some ways in which it might be qualitatively different. Now, for example, some people say that, you know, Islam basically doesn't get on with democracy. So is there a threat to democracy? Some people do not like what is written, I suppose, in the Quran or what is part of the belief about homosexuality. Many people are very unhappy about women being asked to dress in certain ways, or at least dressing in certain ways. So I'm saying if candidates, if parties begin to move on these issues, is that qualitatively different? Is that any kind of threat to democracy or to our cultural values?
Well, I mean, let's first of all be clear about the differences between the Quran and the Bible itself. I mean, comments about homosexuality are relatively the same in both religious texts. I also think, look, there are going to be many Muslims out there that have particularly undemocratic views. There are many Christians that also have that same view, and indeed many Jews and many other religious minorities as well. It doesn't mean
Do you really think that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think that when it comes to, I'm just going to touch on this point very quickly, when it comes to female modesty, the majority of the time it is up to the woman, and it is their choice, and that's how it should be in Islam. It should never be forced on them, and it's actually haram. It's not allowed for a woman to be forced to wear anything, or indeed forced to be married, or forced to do anything against their own wishes. But just touching on the point about the way in which this has impacted the Labour Party itself, I do think there seems to be a particular polarisation, and what this does mean is that you get many, many people who are incredibly moved by the Israel-Palestine issue and actually are unable to sort of decipher any kind of nuance. When you say you're pro-Palestine, what does that mean? When you say you're pro-Israel, what does that actually mean? Are you pro-Hamas? Are you sympathising with the terrorist organisation? Or are you actually saying that the Palestinian people, I care about the humanitarian crisis? So I do think we need to have some nuance here. Clearly, the Labour Party have tried to overcompensate against all of those anti-Semitism accusations during the Corbyn era and have actually then alienated many Muslim voters whilst doing so.
Dennis McShane, do you mind talking to us about your experience as a Member of Parliament? I mean, I'd really like to ask you frankly, did you ever feel you were being asked to strike positions about which you felt uncomfortable, but which nonetheless you might be tempted into because there'd be votes involved?
No, I have two simple stories, and it's good you and I both have the experience, because so much of what I hear from people who've never knocked at a door or sought to be elected, frankly, is just wrong. Right, story number one. During the Iraq War, when it began, I forced 8,000 mainly Kashmiri Muslims in my constituency of Rotherham, lovely, good friends, not lovely people, that's patronising, counsellors, doctors, etc. But yes, they were told by their very politicised leaders, this is an attack on Islam. Just as you hear the same thing, of course, in the context of Israel and Palestine. So I called a meeting in the town hall, very crowded, quite stormy, quite angry. We all did that, Michael, you remember. And I said, OK, I hear what you say. I promise to take your views down as a minister to the Foreign Office, to talk to the Foreign Secretary, and indeed to Tony Blair, the Prime Minister. Your views will be taken into account. But we'll stay friends. There's so many other problems to solve in Rotherham. Yeah, of course, Dennis, of course, Dennis. Look, just before I go, quick question. Hands up all those opposed to the bombing of Baghdad. Every hand went up. Hands up all those who oppose the bombing of the Christian city of Belgrade to stop Milosevic slaughtering European Muslims in Kosovo. You're playing politics, Dennis. You're playing politics. I wasn't. And that's the difference. It is just not rationally thought through, in my view. And a story much more up to date last week, when Rochdale and the question of anti-Semitism was at the top of every news bulletin for about 3 or 4 days. I was out canvassing for the Westminster Labour candidate Rachel Blake in the centre of London, and knocked on 2 hours worth of doors. You did it, Michael. You know what it's like. Not a single person mentioned this. So I just don't think it's the burn-up issue that the press are telling us it is.
Let me give you a much more old-fashioned example. I'm going back nearly 40 years to when I was canvassing in Birmingham Perry Bar. In fact, more than 40 years now, I think about it. And one of the things that made me happy, so this is a sort of cultural issue, is that I would be introduced to community leaders, and I was told, this person controls 10 votes. Yes. This person will bring the entire family. This person controls 20 votes. And I didn't have the courage at the time to say, but that's not the politics I involve in, because I want to talk to every voter. I'm not interested in you telling me that you control, for instance, the women in your family. Should I be more courageous, Dennis?
Not necessarily. I agree with that. But equally, you can go into strong Irish Catholic communities in the day, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Glasgow, in North London, and the Catholic community would deliver votes. I rather expect you can go to a lot of Tory golf clubs in the Shires, and old Colonel Buffer over there, he can bring, get him on your side, and you're sure to be selected, etc. I mean, this is politics.
I think the last one is qualitatively different, but maybe I would say that. Rakib, would you mind reacting to that little discussion we've had there? Any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I think, firstly, I'll just make the point to Dennis. I think that comparing NATO's intervention in the Balkans is somewhat different to the UK and US's illegal intervention in Iraq. I think there are differences there which
I don't disagree, but
the differences need to be recognised.
They were saying that. That's
so I'll just make the point. I think they were very different. I think more generally, I really cringe at the phrase British Muslim community. What we're talking about, the wider British Muslim population is incredibly diverse in terms of ethnicity, Islamic denomination, occupation, social class, level of education, attainment. So I think that we need to do away with that, and we need to recognise that diversity. I think that more generally what we need to see a politics which isn't driven by tribal identitarianism, and I think that the level of conspiratorial beliefs, which has actually wormed its way into our politics, is troubling. And I think that people can issue quite robust and legitimate criticisms without indulging into those conspiratorial beliefs. That would heighten the quality of our politics.
Reem, let's just pick up that point about diversity, because some of the candidates in Rochdale seem to have been behaving as though there were not that diversity, thinking that if they got the Muslim vote, they win. But that is, well, firstly, they can't just get the Muslim vote in one go. And by the way, there's also a majority that isn't Muslim in the town.
Yes, exactly. And there are, a handful of constituencies where the Muslim vote matters incredibly. But also, I think this point is very, very important. Muslims themselves are not just going to vote purely on the Palestine-Gaza issue. And actually, I think what's really interesting is, the economic integration and the way in which Muslims as a whole, or even migrants as a whole, have actually been able to contribute to the economy. There are many that are, conservative voters. My parents are Muslim and they are both conservative voters. So I think what's interesting is the differences and the huge amount of diversity within the Muslim community as a whole, but also the way in which, depending on where they come from, different migrant communities have those different perspectives. Again, there is only a handful of constituencies where the Muslim vote really, really does matter, and they're not purely voting on Israel-Gaza.
Michael, there's only 3 constituencies where Muslims are majority.
Sorry, we're going to finish that. It's been a robust and excellent discussion. So cheering to hear about there being Conservative voters. There's a cartoon of the Telegraph showing a Conservative vote being auctioned at Sotheby's because of its great rarity. Well, we have been discussing the Rochdale by-election, and that means that we have to list the candidates. So there's Azhar Ali, who was the Labour candidate, Mark Coleman, Independent, Simon Danchuk, Reform UK in Donswell, Liberal Democrat, Paul Ellison, Conservative, George Galloway, Workers' Party of Britain, Michael Howarth, Independent, William Howarth, Independent, Guy Otten, Green Party, Ravin Rodin, Subordinate, Official, Monster Raving, Looney, and David Tully, Independent. Thank you very much indeed, Rakib Hassan, Reem Ibrahim and Dennis McShane. After the break, I'll be discussing the economy with Vicky Price and Matthew Lynn of the Daily Telegraph. I will ask how much responsibility does Rishi Sunak bear for the recession that Britain endured at the end of last year. See you in
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Francis, Just Stop Oil have in the past broken the law. I remember distinctly the Dartford crossing. That ended up with 2 jailed, I believe, if I remember correctly. Is it ever justified in your view?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, I would have to say yes. I mean, we're trying to preserve my life, your lives, the lives of your family, and it's not just the planet that we're trying to protect, it's the lives of millions of people. And, we know from history that we have to break the law in order to put pressure on the government and to be listened to.
No one would doubt your sincerity in your views. You genuinely believe in what you fight for. But there are others who think differently. For example, there are Islamist extremists who believe that people will go to hell unless they convert to Islam. They will sincerely, perhaps, break the law in order to force people to convert. In their view, they might be saving people's lives for eternity. There might be abortion activists who say that babies are being murdered and to save their lives, we need to break the law to stop people having abortions. Why do you get to say that your moral conviction is the one that's right and other people's individual moral conviction are those that are wrong?
So what's really integral to the Just Stop Oil campaign is the fact that it is a non-violent campaign. That's what separates us from the examples that you've just given. We're absolutely dedicated non-violence, both as a tactic and as a principle. So though we might be breaking the law...
If individuals take it upon themselves to break the law for whatever their course is, surely the way that we decide what society wants in general is democratic and within the law.
Well, of course, we know also that protest is absolutely integral to maintaining and upholding a democracy, and in particular, non-violent protest. I mean, I really can't express to you how severe this situation is, and I'm sure you know this.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Britain has been in recession, according to the latest economic data. GDP fell in the last 2 quarters of last year, despite Rishi Sunak's signature pledge to grow the economy. The Prime Minister has written in the pages of the Daily Telegraph that despite the news, his plan is working. Well, Matthew Lynn is also at the Telegraph, and he'll give me an assessment of that, as will the economist Vicky Price. Welcome to you both. So, Matthew, he's been writing in your newspaper. How do you assess his responsibility for where we are, the Prime Minister's?
I mean, I think he shares, a decent amount of the blame. Obviously, got the global economic situation and the war in Ukraine and blah and all that. But I think actually, for going into a recession, there are probably 2 specific mistakes that the Prime Minister made. I mean, both as Chancellor and Prime Minister. First, I think he put up taxes too much 18 months ago. We now have the OBR. Sort of, it changes its mind, every few days. But there's probably in this room for like 10, 15 billion of tax cuts. Well, why did you put them up so much 18 months ago? It would actually be better if taxes had been a tiny bit lower for the last 18 months, would have helped demand, would have helped small business. The other big mistake I think that he made was the way he put up taxes. By freezing thresholds, and we're now really seeing this coming home, we're in a crazy situation where some people are facing 60, 70% marginal tax rates, particularly if they have children and student loans. And then, hey, we're surprised that people are leaving the workforce, or we're surprised that people aren't doing an extra shift, and we're surprised that we have labour shortages. So I think those are the 2 big mistakes. Obviously, there's a global outlook and all the rest of it. But there are 2 big mistakes which I think are directly with the responsibility of his policies.
Interestingly, you haven't mentioned what I might have put first, Matthew Lynn, which is the performance of the Bank of England. And I know the Bank of England is independent, but it is answerable to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and to the Prime Minister. The remit is to keep inflation under 2%. It went up to 10%. I don't know what the Chancellor and then the Prime Minister was doing about that. And, of course, the choice of the man who runs the Bank of England is a matter for the government. Why do you not mention that? I mean, that has been the origin of a big part of the government's problems.
No, fair enough. The reason I didn't mention it was because I was answering your question, Michael, which I know is a surprise on your programme. but absolutely, you didn't ask me about the Bank of England. But, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, he, as Chancellor and as Prime Minister, he and Jeremy Hunt are responsible for choosing the Bank of England, and for choosing the Monetary Policy Committee, which I absolutely agree has been very weak. And has, allowed inflation to become too high. If they had moved earlier and been more decisive, we'd be in a slightly different position. So absolutely, if you include his power over the Bank of England, that's the 3rd big mistake he's made.
Vicky, where do you stand on this matter of prime ministerial responsibility for all this?
I think I have to admit that I do agree with quite a lot of the analysis that we just heard just now about what happened in the UK. But you've got to see it, though, in the international context. And we have had a crisis. That crisis has swept across the world. The Western economies all reacted to this by, in fact, raising interest rates just like we have done. In fact, we were the first to raise rates before the US and before the European Central Bank. So we can't say that it was all the Bank of England's fault.
What did inflation reach in Switzerland? Was it 1.7%?
Well, OK, you've got to look at different countries in a different context, depending on how much they were depending, for example, on imported energy or, also how big the economy was. But if you look at places like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, all those Baltic states, inflation was over 20% for quite some time. And because energy prices have come down for certainly 2 of those 3 countries, inflation is now below 1%. So a lot of it has had to do with international factors. And when the government now says our plan is working on inflation, it's got nothing to do with them. And also, frankly, it's got nothing to do with the Bank of England either. But yes, what you were saying about growth, most definitely, the high interest rates are going to affect growth in the longer term. In fact, not just in the longer term. I think one of the things that we're seeing, of course, in terms of the consumer and their spending patterns is that high mortgage rates have had an impact. Now they're beginning to come down and inflation is beginning to come down. They're feeling a lot more confidence. The consumer confidence has gone up in the last few months.
Yes, let's get Matthew to pick up on that. So moving from looking back to looking forward, how much hope can the Prime Minister have? How much hope can we, the poor British population, have that things are going to feel a bit better in the next few months?
I mean, you know, we don't want to be too gloomy, but, you know, the straight answer is not very much. You know, whether you're in a recession or not is actually not the big issue. It's probably going to be, as Vicky was saying, it's probably going to be a fairly shallow recession. There's already some better retail sales data. You know, whether it's -2% per quarter or we might, if we get lucky and there's, you know, everything works out entirely as planned, we might get up to 0.3% positive growth. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that we can't get back to the 2.5% plus rate, which is what we really need, is what we used to have, and what we really need to start feeling like a prosperous country again, for real wages to start growing, for there to be the tax revenues to pay for public services. And that's the big gap. Whether we're -2 or +2, a percentage or a point doesn't really matter. We've got to get back to that 2.5%. And there's very little sign of it from this Prime Minister, and probably from the incoming Prime Minister later this year either.
And Vicky, not to be overly nerdish, but I spotted that for quite a long time now, and fairly consistently, GDP per capita has been coming down. In other words, the amount of wealth per person. Now, that really feeds straight into how good we feel about ourselves, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think the calculations are that we've had 7 quarters of declining GDP per capita, which is pretty bad news, and GDP per capita is well below where it was pre-pandemic. Now, again, this has happened in other countries, but one of the interesting things about the UK is that also population has been going up. In other countries, it's been shrinking. So they don't have quite the same impact on consumers as is the case here. But it is absolutely true that people have felt it in their pockets. What's going on, nevertheless, right now is that finally real wages are increasing. So after a couple of years of real no change, nevertheless, real wages are still staying below where they were pre-pandemic, and in some parts of the population, below where they were pre-financial crisis, which is extraordinary.
It is. That is a very good word to summarise the discussion. I thank you very much for it. Vicky Price and Matthew Lynn. You're watching Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. After the break, I'll be joined by Max Jeffrey, who's just returned from Estonia, where NATO forces are training close to the Russian border.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Lots of people very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. Iran obviously denying it, but the next move from the United States, our key allies, will be absolutely key.
Absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of talk about where this could go, whether the situation could be escalated. But I think the chatter is heading in the right direction, which is about de-escalation. So if there are going to be targeted sanctions against Iran, that's already happened through expelling certain diplomats and other measures there. But you can do that without arm-to-arm combat at this stage. But I think the US will be weighing up all of its options. Antony Blinken obviously gave a press conference in the United States yesterday to say that, there will be a response from the US, but it'll be at their time and it'll be in the way in which they think is the most appropriate. So all eyes are now on the United States as to when it makes that move.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how domestic politics plays so much into international politics. The States, they've got a presidential election this year. We've got a budget coming up. So all the noise, both sides. You've got Donald Trump saying, go a bit more hawkish, I suppose you could say, than President Biden. And here we've got all the generals. We've got the Secretary of State for Defence coming out saying we need conscription, we need more cash. But a lot of that is part of the sort of national narratives rather than actually looking at what's happening in Iran, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it plays into, the very uncertain times that we're living. And you're absolutely right. There'll be supporters of Donald Trump who are clearly adversaries of Joe Biden to say we must act now. It's a demonstration of showing your strength. Opponents of Biden will say that the US looks weak if it doesn't take action now against Iran, who are clearly, as we know, funding these at arm's length organisations like Hezbollah in Tehran, like the Houthis who are carrying out the attacks in the Red Sea. So Iran is responsible.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back. Max Jeffrey has just returned from Estonia, where NATO forces are training close to the Russian border, simulating how an incursion by Putin's troops might be resisted. His cover story in The Spectator magazine is timely as predictions of a future conflict with Russia fill the airwaves, and as Ukrainian forces are forced to retreat after being overwhelmed by Russian attacks in the eastern town of Avdiivka. Max, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So tell us about the scale of these exercises that are going on in Estonia and who's involved.
These are exercises in Tapa, which is Estonia's biggest military base. So Estonia, it's right in the middle of Tapa, and it's about a 2-hour drive from the Russian border. And these are exercises involving Estonian troops, American, British and French. The one that I saw was between the Estonians and then against the rest. So the Estonians were defending 2 roads that run up north through a forest. And the Americans, the Brits, the French had Challenger 2 tanks. So these are some of the best tanks that the West has. It had a HIMARS artillery system, an F-16 jet, and the Estonians had Swedish tanks. They had their own bits and pieces as well. And this was simulating a Russian invasion of Estonia. It's minus 20 degrees, trench warfare, and a foot of snow. Obviously, they're not using live ammunition. They have lasers, so everyone has body sensors on them, and artillery systems. When they're used, a message goes back to base, and they calculate how many soldiers would have died. They then leave the battlefield.
Are you able to make any calculation of how well the exercise went? I mean, let's start with obvious things. Did you see things breaking down in the ice and snow, tanks and vehicles and so on?
They admitted that kit really doesn't work in these sort of temperatures, and not often cases. Engines don't start, guns sometimes don't work. Even very simple things. We were travelling around the exercise in an armoured vehicle, and things like trying to get the door open and shut when you've got frost holding it closed become really difficult. Equipment isn't made to be used at this temperature, and actually neither are the soldiers, frankly. A lot of the foreign forces, in particular, this was their first time operating in this sort of a temperature, and people find it really difficult, especially when you're in trenches. That's something that we've seen in Ukraine, and so that's something that they're trying to mimic. They're trying to mimic Russian tactics, trying to anticipate what a conflict with Russia would look like. So they're having to operate in trenches in minus 20 degrees. Equipment and people just often aren't ready for it.
I assume they're in white uniforms.
Yeah, white camouflage.
Do you think they were insulated? Were they kept warm physically?
Yeah, it looked like they had really good kit, to be honest. Like the boots they had that were going right up to their knees, warm helmets, hats, big military gloves. I was freezing cold, but they looked quite warm, to be honest with you.
Did you manage to talk to any soldiers?
Yeah, I spoke to a couple of British soldiers, the Estonian ones. The Brits said they'd not seen anything like this in terms of the temperature. I asked them about their readiness for conflict. They actually seemed a bit more... they said they weren't, in all honesty, thinking that a war with Russia was all that likely. The Estonians said their favourite phrase was, "We were ready yesterday." They think that if Russia made an incursion across their border, that they'd be ready to fight them.
Don't you quote a comment by a soldier about fighting the migrant boats?
Yeah, he said, "We're already in war and it's against migration. We can't stop the dinghies." And then he sort of shrugged his shoulders as if insinuating we might not have that good a chance against the Russians.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me that while we're learning, I mean, certainly British troops will be learning from first principles about warfare in a cold climate. The Russians, on the other hand, must be learning a great deal because they've been 2 years in a war in which they did very badly at the beginning, but now seem to be doing rather better. Do you have a feeling about how much the Russians are learning?
I think a great deal. And you talk about the way that the troops are learning, but also the economy. Russia's economy is now on a war footing. They're producing a huge amount of artillery shells. And in contrast, Europe promised to deliver to Ukraine 1 million artillery shells by spring of this year. They're only going to send 600,000. Russian troops are used to operating in this kind of weather. They're used to fighting Western forces. They've also learned Western tactics. They've learned that they can jam HIMARS artillery systems. These were some of the best artillery systems that the West had. And in many cases now, the Russian forces have learned how to hack, how to jam them.
So Ukraine is very interesting because, I mean, it struck me I suppose, after about 6 months, that in a way it couldn't be better for NATO because Russia was being humiliated in Ukraine. We were watching how ineffective the Russian military machine was. We were, wearing away that there was attrition of their resources, and we weren't having to do anything except supply artillery. Things now look a bit different because they are improving their tactics, and we now have this political situation where we may throw away all the advantage that we had by saying that we're simply not going to keep supplying them with ammunition. This is the position with the United States at the moment, let alone when Trump becomes president.
Yeah, it's really difficult, Michael, because on the one hand, Europe wants to continue arming Ukraine, but at the same time, Europe itself is actually running low on armaments. In Estonia, for instance, they don't have a proper air defence system. They were promised one last year at the Vilnius summit, the Vilnius NATO summit, the annual meeting of NATO countries, and they haven't got that yet because they're all in Ukraine. They think that there'll be something to fill that gap, but we're running low on artillery systems, we're running low on everything. In many instances, I just don't think they are ready.
The thing that most depresses me, and here there's the great historical precedent, is that politicians in the West don't want to talk about how bad things are and how much things would have to change if we were to put our economy onto a war footing, if we were to spend more on defence. And Stanley Baldwin, looking back on why we didn't rearm in the 1930s, said, if at the general election I had spoken with appalling frankness, that was his phrase. In other words, if he'd admitted how bad things were, if he'd started talking about rearmament, he wouldn't have been re-elected. One feels that at the moment, that, we can see there's this desperate situation, but the politicians don't want to talk about it because we're having a general election.
And there's a divide as well, isn't there? Because the Baltic states talk about it very frankly. The Estonians say that they're really worried that this could happen soon. They say 3 to 5 years, the Prime Minister of Estonia says. Poland's head of national security says exactly the same. Denmark's defence minister, also the German defence minister. Here in the UK, though, we do hear very little of it. It's strange because you would think that actually building resilience among the civilian population would be a good thing. I think, though, we are starting to see that. You saw the head of the British Army talking about conscription, not saying that it was needed exactly, but trying to ready the population for the eventuality of conflict.
Something is starting, but I think not yet in the political class. Anyway, Max Jeffrey has written a fascinating piece. It's the cover story in The Spectator. Thank you very much. After the break, Stefan Kyriazis will be here to update us on no fewer than 4 new theatrical productions.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Mike Freer joins me now. Mike, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Firstly, how are you?
It's been a busy day, and it's been quite a traumatic experience. It's a real wrench to walk away from a job that you love, but also a constituency that you've become. I live there; it's my home, and I regard many of my constituents as friends, and it is an amazing place. And to walk away from that is really quite. It's quite an emotional wrench to think this was a job I loved, but unfortunately I can't do it anymore.
Can you talk me through the process? Because you mentioned about the alleged arson attack, etc., being the final straw, but this has been a really quite vile journey to get to this point. So what kind of threats have you had? What's that look like?
Well, like every MP, I mean, you day in, day out, you get abusive emails, you get low-level stuff that, whether we should accept it, but we do, it's graffiti, it's things like, in the past I've had a mock Molotov cocktail left on the office door, meaning we had to evacuate the whole building. I've come out of my house and found a note on my car. Where I live is common knowledge, but what I drive is less so. And it's a few weeks after John Mann had the wheel nuts on his car tampered with. So that all kind of makes you get a bit, what on earth's going on. But I've had 2 run-ins with the organisation that was Muslims Against Crusades, and people like Anjem Chowdhury, who was behind that organisation, been to prison. But online it said, I used to do surgery in mosques, surgery mosques. So I wanted to go out and see people. And online, there's a picture of me saying, "You're not welcome in our mosque. Let Stephen Timms be a pointed reminder." So it's not very subtle.
Well, just for our viewers and listeners who might not remember that,
Stephen Timms, of course, was stabbed by a woman who'd been radicalised. Thank heavens he survived. So it was a very unsubtle.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Stefan Kyriazis has sidled into the studio and is bristling to begin his theatre review after a packed schedule. So I believe you've been to see 4 shows.
Yes.
And part of it, you had an Oscar-wild time.
I certainly did. It's the very famous The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is following the trait we're getting recently of one actor performing all the roles. So we had Andrew Scott in Vanya, we had Dickens with Eddie Izzard, and now Sarah Snook, who was the repulsive, like all of them, Shiv in Succession. And she's on stage. It's a Sydney Theatre production from 2020. I don't know whether to say this is theatre, multimedia. It's extraordinary. She ends the whole thing sweaty, literally a little bit of snot. She's given us everything. And we are all just sat in our chairs going, what did I just see? So the basic premise is I have a problem with one person playing all the characters because you can just be like, Michael, how dare you say that to me? Oh, I'm terribly sorry, old chap. And you can't get reactions, you can't get dialogue. But they solve this with, there are numerous screens all the time. They come up and down, in and out, backdrops. She's on stage, she's being filmed all the way through. That's being thrown up on screens all the time. So she can talk to herself as other characters as we go through the entire story. There's a dinner party with about 8 people there. She sat at the end of the table, screen along there. They all appear one by one, all black behind. I couldn't tell it was real or not. It's incredible. And Dorian Gray is all about fracturing of the self. It's Wilde's obsession with how we see ourselves, how we want people to see us, and how people actually see us. So it's playing with all these ideas of representation.
You're saying incredible, and you're passionate, as you always are. So you're saying incredibly good. I mean, you had a great evening, did you?
I had a great... I was exhausted. I didn't know what I made of it as I came out of it.
Oh, dear.
But I massively enjoyed it. I knew I'd seen something, and actually, I had a few quibbles. There's a few times where she's off stage a little bit too often, or she's obscured by the camera people. However, again, this is all about visuals, about perception, and so the more I thought about it, I normally talk myself down. I talked myself up in this case. You have to see it. It's unlike anything you've seen.
Where and when?
This is on at the moment at the Theatre Royal Haymarket until May the 11th.
OK.
Glorious.
Now, you and I have both been to see a theatrical production about the Live Aid concert of, what was it, 1985?
Just for one day.
Just for one day, it's called. I went to see it, so I would say it had a very clunky script. It was unbelievably sentimental. However, and now begins the however, I thought the cast were fantastic. A group of people who both sing and dance and do both of those things very well. And the audience was just so enthusiastic. An audience in which I was of the typical, I would say. So that,
yes.
So that is my amateurish review of it.
Yes.
Shall we see?
We've got a little clip.
Let's have a clip.
16 hours of Live Aid.
This is the most important pop event ever.
It's a staggering achievement to actually have done this, and it will be the concert of the decade.
Box offices in London have been besieged by fans queuing for the tickets.
It's all these people. I mean, it's making history.
The organisers say the pop marathon shown worldwide should raise at least £10 million.
Well, that certainly expresses some of the emotion of the day back in 1985. OK, so that was my amateur review. What's the professional one?
I hate to agree with you, Michael. It bothers me, but I'm very much on page with the dialogue and exposition is painful. It's so amdram. And it's a very clunky conceit of where in present day, Bob Geldof is weary and sweary, as always, and he encounters a Gen Zer, and she wants to know what it was all about, and also why it was all old white men. And my generation, unlike The Who, would do it very differently. And then he has to explain the whole story. And, you know, it's it's an incredible story. Yeah. His chutzpah in pulling it all off, lying to everybody to make it happen. So it's inspiring, incredible. The numbers, yes, there's the nostalgia is pouring out of it. The problem we have with all of this, it's also a very serious issue. So the same when at Live Aid they played those images from Ethiopia, it hit so hard. We don't really get those images.
That's true.
We just get mentions of it, and we get this odd imbalance. There's, for some reason, a rapping comedy Margaret Thatcher that actually played very well to the audience, oddly. But straight after, we cut to Bob recalling being in a tent in Ethiopia with a child dying in his arms. It just clashes and jars. And yes, I agree, cast were phenomenal, voices were phenomenal, but its musical theatre does rock. And it sounds glorious, but I like a bit of rasp in my rock, and you can't get that same kind of vein-straining and sort of anthemic feel to it. So it's a thing. No sets, so no sense of place. For me, it was a little bit like nostalgic karaoke.
Just to give the viewer one sense of place, it's on at the Old Vic.
It's on at the Old Vic. It is a fun, great experience. It's on until March the 30th. And we have an even more stunning show. Hills of California.
This is Jez Butterworth.
This is Jez Butterworth, the Hills of California.
Give us a word of background on Jez Butterworth.
So this is the man that famously wrote Jerusalem with Mark Rylance, which is possibly the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. That is very much a one-man dominated show. I mean, it was extraordinary, written for him, mind-blowing. This is much more female-centric, inspired by Butterworth's loss of his sister to cancer. So this is much more a family drama. And we kick off in 1976 at the Seaview Motel in Blackpool. It's clapped out. There's an absolute drought. We remember the summer of 76. Drought outside. There is no Seaview. And this is about the dreams of the four sisters. The mother is dying upstairs, and we flash backwards and forwards to the 1950s. Nobody writes dialogue like Jez Butterworth. It's stunning. You know, a line like the highlight of their social calendar was winning tickets at bingo to go to dinner with Ken Dodd at the Lobster Pot, which I can't deliver properly. But the rhythms, the sense of place, the sense of time, the performances are extraordinary. Flawless. 4 older women and the 4 girls playing them in their youth.
Is there a but?
There's a tiny but, only because it's so fantastic, so raw, so real. And unusually, I mean, I guess the end of Jerusalem is wish fulfillment rousing if you choose to believe a certain thing. This is much more direct. It gives a kind of sentimental, tidy, reassuring ending. And I normally like it. I love a happy ending. I hate being traumatised. This, I just wish he'd stuck to his guns a little bit more, but still, stunning performances, beautiful stuff. Highly recommended.
You've got one up your sleeve and you've got about 2 minutes.
I have. Hills of California at the Harold Pinter to June the 15th. And then tonight, if anyone's in town, there's still a few tickets left, there is Dance for Ukraine. It's a ballet gala. The big draw is that Olga Smirnova, who was the Bolshoi principal, who quit Russian. She quit Russia and the Bolshoi in protest at the invasion of Ukraine. She is teaming up with Ivan Puchov, who is a Ukrainian ballet icon. People are flying in from Japan, Sweden, Latvia, everywhere, like international ballet stars. Huge gala tonight. There's going to be the most stunning dancing. It's for a great cause. I talked to Ivan about this, or Ivan. It's so easy to forget what's going on sometimes. And also still the power of art to inspire, to unite, to give hope.
Surely you can't get a ticket for this at this stage.
There are still some tickets left. There's a few tickets left. So I would recommend people, if they're at all interested in dance or arts or anything like that, the lineup is staggering. You won't see something like this again. So thoroughly, highly recommended.
And you'll be there?
I'm going. I cannot wait. I'm very excited.
Have you got tickets for the Pet Shop Boys at the Royal Opera House?
No, I've seen it before. When
You've seen the show?
And when they did it before. And they are... Again, this is my youth, and they know how to do it. And also, they love as well this mix of the sort of high-end classy artiness of the Royal Opera House with kind of thumping synth pop as well.
Well, that's the thing that attracted me, because, you know, I go to the Royal Opera House all the time, but I've never seen the Pet Shop Boys there. I never dreamed that I'd see Pet Shop Boys there. It is actually part of a British tour, of course.
And also Message in a Bottle, that we both loved.
Yes.
That's also on at the Royal Opera House for a couple of nights over the summer. That's on a tour. So, and that's all the music of Sting, rock, modern dance in that environment again. So, yeah, tons of stuff going on.
You're coming in here day after day being very enthusiastic. Theatre's in a pretty good place, isn't it?
Theatre's an exciting place. There's great names coming in. There's great productions being put on. We seem to have moved past the slightly negative lecturing that came after the lockdown. So it feels hopeful. Expensive, but hopeful.
Yeah, it certainly is expensive. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm, Stefan Kyriazis. You're watching Michael Portillo on GB News, which is Britain's news channel. We're coming to the end of the first hour. I will be back in a few minutes. We're going to be talking about Parisian booksellers who were apparently going to be forced away from selling their books by the River Seine because of the Olympics, and having talked to someone from France about the triumph of the booksellers who are going to be able to maintain their position. We'll move over to Italy to talk about truffle hunters, and there will be truffles in the studio. So those are good reasons to stay with us.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, I'm Marco Patagna. Here's your latest weather update from the Met Office. We hold on to rather mixed conditions weather-wise across the UK over the next few days. Rain at times, but staying quite mild for the time being at least. This weather front will clear outbreaks of rain away from the southeast of England as we go through Sunday afternoon. A ridge of high pressure then moving in from the west, quietening things down for a time, but further rain is waiting in the wings. So confirmation of outbreaks of rain across the southeast first thing this afternoon, moving away towards the east and southeast though. Then it's a case of sunshine with a few showers around, plenty of bright weather though, and a little bit breezy too, but on the mild side for the time of year. Temperatures generally in double figures, up to 14 or 15 Celsius down towards the southeast. 15 is a very mild 59 in Fahrenheit. As we go through the evening and overnight, the showers will tend to ease. We'll see plenty of clear weather around, some mist and fog patches forming, particularly out towards the west and southwest. But notice outbreaks of rain returning across Scotland and Northern Ireland with blustery showers into the far northwest by the morning. A pretty mild night, temperatures generally into the low to mid single figures towards the north in rural spots, but elsewhere mid to upper single figures. As for Monday, well, outbreaks of rain working their way southeastwards across England and Wales, weakening all the while, with sunshine and showers following towards the north and west of the UK. Some of those showers quite blustery towards the west and northwest of Scotland. But once again, it's a mild day for the time of year. Temperatures generally in double figures, ranging from 9 or 10 degrees at best towards the north, up to 13 or 14 down towards the southeast.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system. And
so there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offender behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. We'll begin with an ethical debate. How far should Britain adapt to new arrivals? The contrived controversy over the alleged racism of the British countryside sparked an acrimonious public debate. But is there a deeper question? How can we protect important cultural values without being exclusionary towards minorities? Last year, we reported from Paris, where the famous booksellers alongside the River Seine were in revolt over plans to relocate them during the Summer Olympics. Now, President Macron has decreed that the bouquinistes will stay put. I'll be joined by one who's celebrating this victory for entrenched Gallic resistance. And moving from France to Italy, I'll be joined by Francesco Di Maddaloni, who will arrive armed with truffles to explain this elusive and exclusive ingredient. All of that to come. But first, your news headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Michael, thank you. It's 1 minute past 12. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Your top story this hour. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands as he pushed Republicans to urgently pass more military aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. Former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine needs more support.
Loss of Avdiivka is significant. The Ukrainians have been holding on to that since 2014 and fighting the Russians. But they've made the sensible military decision not to sacrifice any more of their troops to keep this completely decimated piece of territory. The Russians are making some advances from a one-dimensional perspective on the front line, but these advances are tiny at the moment, and it's purely because Russia has got more ammunition from North Korea and from Iran. And the Ukrainians are suffering a shortage of ammunition coming from the West.
More than 400 people have been detained across 32 Russian cities since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. It's the biggest wave of unrest since September 2022, when more than 1,300 were arrested for protesting against forced military service, part of President Putin's effort to cover heavy casualties endured in Ukraine. Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny. Meanwhile, authorities have been accused of doing everything they can to avoid handing over Mr. Navalny's body to his family. Yesterday, the 69-year-old mother of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic visited the remote penal colony where he died. She says she has was told his body had been taken to a nearby morgue, but when she arrived there, she found it closed. Mr. Navalny's spokespeople claim his death was orchestrated murder by the Russian president. That's been rejected by the Kremlin. Political analyst and Russian exile Valery Morozov told GB News it looks like revenge.
Payback for Navalny. And the people who were behind, they've just decided that, you know, Putin has enough support, about 70–80%. There is no problem, and just to get rid of Navalny, they've sent him from the prison, which was about 200 kilometers from Moscow to far north, and let him stay there and die.
Ukrainian refugees will be offered an 18-month visa extension to stay in the UK. It means Ukrainians who had to flee their home after Russia's invasion will be able to stay in Britain until at least September 2026. The Foreign Secretary will visit the Falkland Islands amid calls in Argentina for talks on the future of the archipelago. Lord Cameron insists the sovereignty of the territory will not be up for discussion as he prepares for the first visit by a cabinet minister since 2016. Last month, Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, called for the islands to be handed over to his country. A vote in 2013 found almost all residents prefer to remain part of the United Kingdom. A violent riot erupted on the streets of The Hague last night after anti-government groups clashed rival communities. What started as peaceful Eritrean community meetings last night ended in violence, with police cars torched and objects thrown at officers. Video shared online showed groups of people setting fire to cars and engaging in violence. The Hague's mayor says an emergency order was issued and police presence has been increased. And the King was seen smiling and waving as he attended church in Sandringham this morning. Braving the wet weather, His Majesty and the Queen clutched umbrellas in their first public outing since Prince Harry's interview on US television. The Duke of Sussex is said to be willing to undertake some royal duties while his father undergoes treatment for cancer, though there's reportedly been no changes to current arrangements. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophia Wensler. Some country dwellers reacted with fury to the accusation made by a charity organisation in a report to Parliament that Britain's rural areas are racist and symptomatic of colonialism. But before we open up a new front in the culture war, should we perhaps settle what some of these terms mean? Is it racist or colonial to maintain a prevailing culture in a country and to expect new arrivals to adapt to it or even celebrate it? Is it possible to expect that without being exclusionary? To answer that question, I'm joined now by Momas Najmi, who came to this country from Pakistan in 2010 and now lives in Malden in Essex. And I'm joined by Kent Lass and political commentator Joe Phillips. Welcome to you both. Momas, I am the son of an immigrant, and I must say that I am a conformist and an integrationist. I wanted to be part of this country. I wanted to disappear into, into its establishment. What was your own experience?
I think so it would be similar, because you have to ask yourself the question, why are you coming to Britain, right? So if you're coming to Britain, you're coming to be part of Britain if you love the country. So by that standard, you have to want to adapt to all its cultures, values, and traditions. So that was my experience as well, that this is the reason why I wanted to come.
Why did you love this country before you came to it? What was it that attracted you to it?
Well, I grew up with a lot of English literature and a lot of media from England, and I was always a fan of history, so I read a lot of history, and it just attracted me so much because it's such a rich history out of all the European countries that England has. So even though I was born in Kuwait and I was living in Kuwait in the Middle East, my schooling was more British, and it just attracted me, and it was something that I chimed with viscerally, that I thought, like, this is something that I want to be a part of.
I don't know whether one would describe Malden in Essex as suburban or rural, But in any case, what's been your experience there? Is it a white preserve? Is it colonial? Have you felt?
Yeah, it's a town. I would say it's in between suburban and countryside sort of an area. I've been here for a year, and I would say it's the most friendliest place that I've encountered. There's obviously the majority of people living over here are white British, but the thing is that they keep the culture intact of Britain, and I find that to be more assuring, because then I can learn further things that I don't even know about English culture and stuff. And this is the reason why whichever country that you go to, that you want to be with the locals, especially if you want to be a part of that country. So it has been very warm. All my neighbors are very friendly, and we get along really well. It's one of the best places I've been.
You're saying then that it's been friendlier than other places that you've been to in Britain, is that right?
Yes, especially London.
Sorry to hear that. What happened to you in London?
Well, I would discuss. I'm sure everyone has seen the movie Paddington, right? So, do you remember when Paddington Bear comes to Paddington Station at the first time, right? And when he comes in, he's at a loss because he has his own manners and stuff. What has been taught to him and what has been told to him to expect that from Britain, and all of a sudden it's not there. That was my experience when I came to London in 2010. I didn't find it to be English at all, even then. And I only stayed there for probably 8 months, and then I left, because all I found was these different gangs, and they had their different issues and stuff. There wasn't a predominant English culture over there. So that's why I started going more and more towards Essex, and finally I found a place which is more English than other places.
And just give us an example of what you mean by this English culture. How do you recognise it? How do you know you didn't experience it in London?
Well, first of all, everyone speaks English, so that's good to know. And plus, the thing is, there's a kind of politeness, there's a mannerisms, there's a kind of nature. It's an inherent thing. I think so. It's a disposition to someone being British, rather than the aesthetics of, like, you know, the clothes that someone wear or the food that someone eats and stuff. That doesn't, in my mind, that doesn't make someone British. It's a disposition of how people behave with each other. And I don't know how to describe it properly, but I think so that's what was missing, the cultural sort of aspect of it.
Mamas, would you hold on the line for a moment? I'm going to talk to Joe Phillips, who's in the studio. Come back to you probably right at the end. Joe, so you're resident in Essex.
Kent.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Other side of the estuary,
yes, we've got a contrast here, which is marvellous. Now, did you recognise this description of the countryside as being racist or colonial?
I didn't. And it's interesting that there has been such a fury in response to this. It's interesting that the Countryside and Wildlife Link, who were giving evidence to MPs about this, have now distanced themselves and say that the comments have been taken out of context. The countryside, you know, very, very rural areas may be predominantly white, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are racist. And I think, you know, one of the things that certain people who live in towns and cities don't recognise, and I think it's not covered very much in the media and the sort of the urban bubble, is there's an awful lot of poverty and deprivation in the countryside. You know, there's no broadband, the public transport's absolutely rubbish. You know, you've got to drive everywhere. If you haven't got a car, then you're stuck. When I was growing up on a farm, I would have given my eye teeth for a bus shelter, never mind a bus. Yes. So I don't think the countryside is inherently racist any more than anywhere else is. And I think there's a great danger, Michael, that we get caught up in the conversations about diversity and we put it into the prism of the colour of somebody's skin instead of the diversity of everything, whether you have got visual impairments, whether you've got hearing impairments, whether you're older, whether you've got autism. You know, there are all sorts of ways at looking at diversity. And I think we've got caught up in this thing that it's only about the colour of somebody's skin.
But let's take a concrete example. So let's say you've got a village pub. Now, in a village pub, probably kind of everybody knows everybody else. And let's say suddenly a Black Briton from London turns up. Is that Black Briton going to feel welcome? Is that Black Briton going to feel comfortable walking into a village pub?
Well, I can't say whether that person or anybody else from from outside the village would feel comfortable. What I could say is that an awful lot of village pubs have closed, and a lot of them have had to diversify in order to stay open, you know, whether that's running a grocer's store or going for sort of gastro food or whatever. I think that's a really important point about welcoming and inclusivity. And actually, when you were talking about theatre shows just now, just before the news, you know, one of the things that has made theatre so much more accessible is the brilliant system of the National Theatre live screening, which means, you know, you don't have to anymore spend a fortune on transport and a ticket and hope that you might be able to see the stage from behind a pillar. You can go to your local cinema for a tenner or a little bit more than that, and if you don't like it, you can go home.
Let me share with you an experience that I had, though, because I appear in theatres quite a lot to do a sort of monologue. And I remember, for example, going to Leicester and looking at the audience, and I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying it was 100% white. Now, Leicester is a city which is, you know, about 50% non-white.
Absolutely.
So this was extraordinary, but presumably it was self-selection. I mean, no one was saying we don't welcome coloured, you know, dark faces here.
No, exactly. And, you know, you're a white man, you're a former Conservative minister, you might not have had the same appeal to different groups of people. And I think, you know, there's a great danger that we're trying to impose what we think is right on people. But the most important thing is that people have access to a variety of experiences. And I mean, to go back to the point that Momus was making, you know, we're an island. Our culture is created from all the people that have been through, stayed or gone, and the cultures that we've imported and accepted of our own, and it's always changing.
Let me just bring in Momus again. I hope you're still there.
I'm there.
Momus, we're at a stage, I think, where we feel quite uncomfortable saying, look, new arrivals in this country have to adapt to the country they find rather than the other way around. Would you say to Joe and me, who might feel uncomfortable saying that, would you say, be relaxed about saying that, that's the right thing to say? What would your reaction be to that?
Well, let me tell you a story, right? So the first time when I came over here in 2010, I went to uni, and my professor in uni, he was a bit like that, hesitant and saying, oh, because of whatever slavery, whatever has happened, he's very hesitant in portraying his Britishness. And I was as surprised then as I am now. I don't think so anyone should feel ashamed of their country. It's mental to me, I think so, to even think like that. Because, I mean, you are actually being racist, like those people are actually being racist to the white people for making them feel ashamed to love their own country. And to answer also that question, how would a black person would feel entering a village pub which is full of white people? Well, it depends on how that black person interacts with people, you know?
Joe, some of this also has to do with sort of stately homes. Is there something about the stately home, which is one of the rural activities people go to do tourism, is there something about the stately home which is sort of profoundly colonial or white?
Yeah, well, yes, I think it is. And I think, you know, a lot of this is about class, as I said at the beginning. And, you know, there will be people, white people as well, who will go around stately homes and be absolutely horrified at the amount of wealth, the plundering, if you like, treasures and looters. Yes, exactly. But it's about putting it in context. And, you know, they'll also be appalled at how, you know, people working on the estate, for instance, were kept in poverty and, you know, deprived of various things. But it is part of our history, it's part of our culture. I think it's up to institutions to work out how they can put it into context. I mean, just to give you an example, and actually, Momus, if you ever feel like crossing the river and coming to Kent, you should go to a place called Quecks Park, which is a wonderful example of something that lots of people would find difficult about sort of early exploration and stuff like that. But the research that is still going on, I was there not very long ago, and there were scientists from Oslo University who are doing research on bones and stuff that were brought back. But it's open. Kids can open drawers and find things. They can play with things. And it's about that, you know, feeling part of it, not just looking at it through a glass and not being allowed to touch it.
Nothing exclusionary about that. That's been a most interesting discussion. Many thanks to Momas Najmi and to Joe Phillips here in the studio. After the break, we'll move over to Paris, from where I'll be joined by one of the French capital's booksellers, who's celebrating a famous victory as the bouquinistes of the River Seine are told that they won't be removed ahead of this year's Summer Olympics. Stay with us, please.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of three abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, you know, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. In another example of French resistance, Parisian booksellers who have famously plied their trade along the banks of the River Seine for centuries revolted last year over a government plan to relocate them during the Summer Olympics. The chant went up, "We shall not be moved." President Macron has heard their cries and decreed that the bouquinistes, who are valued by Parisians and by travellers from all over the world, must be allowed to stay put. To celebrate this victory, I'm joined by Pascal Courceau, who is a bookseller who helped to lead the campaign against relocation. Pascal, welcome and congratulations on your great victory. Why do you think you did win?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the decision was taken to organize this ceremony on the River Seine as something very new. Normally it's organized in stadiums, and they decided to, the authorities decided to make it along the river, which I think is a very great idea. But they have to take into account so many parameters, And all along the month, they discovered that some of these parameters were the bikinis. And they came to terms with the idea that maybe we should stay there since we are so important and so famous in the world.
What was the argument for moving you in the first place? I understand that it was to do with security.
Indeed.
Was it a strong argument or a weak argument?
No, I think it is a strong argument. It's a very serious argument. But again, as I said, this ceremony is being built all along the month, So it is a strong argument, and we're going to help them to securize the premises and the place, You didn't say it, but I'm the vice president of this association, the Association of the Bouquinistes. And in fact, we do want this ceremony to happen, and we know there's a security that has to be, that the place has to be secured, But as a representative of the Bouquinistes, we have to make sure that we would still work and still have some income,
Yes.
This is why we fought.
Many people will know about the Bouquinistes. We will have shopped with you. We will have admired your stalls alongside the River Seine. But can you tell me about the emotional connection between the Bouquinistes and Paris? Because the argument is made that the Bouquinistes really kind of represent the soul and the history and the orientation of the people of Paris.
Well, you have to bear in mind that the first royal edict made about the selling books, the book trade, was made in 1577. And the books started being sold along the river in the 17th century. So more or less, we've been there for 450 years, and it was well organized and sort of ruled with a règlement, in the 19th century, first with the First Empire, and then in the Second Empire with the Napoleon III, and we were allowed to leave our books and to leave our boxes, because the stalls are called boxes. There are about 4 boxes by stall, and we were allowed to leave the boxes in 1891. So you see, these boxes have been there for 140 years. And what happens is that we didn't know we were so important to everybody, because it's like trees, you've got a tree, you don't think of it. You think of it when people say we're going to cut it up, otherwise you don't think of it. And I think that the Bouquinistes are a bit like trees, they are there and everybody is happy to see them. And suddenly when you decide to remove them, then you discover that they exist and that they are so important,
What would have happened if someone had said, let's cut down the trees? But what I was asking you before about the connection, I was really thinking that I think, France is a very literary country, Paris is a very literary city, Parisians are very literary people. There is a kind of spiritual connection between the people and what you do, that display of books, and so many people who display their interest in books.
Well, yes, on all France, as you know, is a very centralized country, and all the publishers, most of the publishers are in Paris, and the writers and all the intellectual world, For instance, my stalls are just a few yards away from the French Institute, and the French Institute is the place where there's the Académie Française and Académie des Beaux-Arts and so on. And all these people supported us because I mean, we're part of the scenery, you know, and.
Yes, indeed. Pascal, may I ask you? It looks like. Oh dear, looks like the line has frozen. I was just going to ask Pascal what had actually taken him into being a bouquiniste in the first place. But anyway, that was Pascal Courceau, and he was celebrating with me the fact that the bouquinistes, the booksellers in Paris, are going to be allowed to stay put. They were going to be moved out during the course of the Olympics in Paris in order, because it was said that that was necessary for security. But a way through has been found after the intervention of President Macron. So after the break, we're going to be looking at Cornwall's contribution to the world of television drama. Before that, your news headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Thanks, Michael. It's 12:28. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands as he pushed Republicans to urgently pass more military aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. More than 400 people have been detained across 32 Russian cities since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. It's the biggest wave of unrest since September 2022, when more than 1,300 were arrested for protesting against forced military service, part of President Putin's effort to cover heavy casualties endured in Ukraine. Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny. A violent riot erupted on the streets of The Hague last night after anti-government groups clashed with rival communities. What started as peaceful Eritrean community meetings last night ended in violence, with police cars torched and objects thrown at officers. Video shared online showed groups of people setting fire to cars and engaging in violence. The Hague's mayor says an emergency order was issued and police presence has been increased. And the King was seen smiling and waving as he attended church in Sandringham this morning. Braving the wet weather, His Majesty and the Queen clutched umbrellas in the first public outing since Prince Harry's interview on US television. The Duke of Sussex is said to be willing to undertake some royal duties while his father undergoes treatment for cancer, though there's reportedly been no changes to current arrangements. And for the latest story, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Lots of people have different ideas, but principally a conservative approach to getting growth is to reduce taxes so that people, ordinary people and businesses can spend more of their own money to invest and grow the economy.
So the theory is that you cut taxes and that then pumps more money into the economy.
Exactly right. And then people, it's not government that are creating wealth. It's individuals, businessmen, companies that create wealth. It's the private sector that creates wealth, that the public sector then taxes and spends.
I get the theory, but one of the criticisms of you, and I think one of the criticisms actually of all political parties, is they appear to be incapable of cutting government spending.
That's the key. I mean, and I think when I look back, is that we should have had a credible plan to reduce the increase in spending. Now, that's often a difficult concept to explain.
But it's in line with inflation, etc.
That's all right. So when you're slowing the increase, it means, you know, one year you spend £100 and the next year you spend maybe £101 as opposed to going up to £110. So the actual level isn't going down, but you're slowing the increase. And that's very much what I tried to do. And actually, looking back, the one thing I wish I'd done, was to present a credible spending plan at the same time as the tax cuts that we announced.
You had a go, it didn't work out for whatever reason, and that analysis will go on for some years to come. We have Jeremy Hunt there as Chancellor now, hinting quite strongly now there won't be any tax cuts, but the truth of it is, under 14 years of Conservatives, for a variety of reasons, the tax burden has risen.
That's right.
To the highest since the Attlee government, way back in
80 years,
1951, whatever it is.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. Doc Martin, Poldark and Jamaica Inn are just some of the TV shows that are set and filmed in Cornwall. It's easy to see why it's a popular filming location. It's got rolling coastlines and picturesque cottages. But some people are calling for television programmes to more accurately reflect Cornish life today. Our South West of England reporter Jeff Moody has this report.
The tale of Ross Poldark, who returned to England in the 1700s after fighting in the American Revolution, has captured the imagination of millions, not just for its narrative, but for the swashbuckling image of Cornwall it presents. But Cornish MP Steve Double thinks this is only half the story.
Although we love to see Cornwall on the TV, all too often it feels like it's an advert for second homeowners, that it's that sort of picture postcard idealistic view of what life in Cornwall is like, when actually we have such a rich heritage, we have a real rich and diverse culture within Cornwall. Our history is full of great moments and really significant things where we have contributed to the UK and in fact the world, and I think we would just like to see more of that more accurately represented on the TV.
In 2014, the Cornish were granted national minority status under the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. They now have the same status as the UK's other Celtic people, the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish.
Since then, we've been kind of grappling with exactly what that means, and I think through this media bill, there was an opportunity to kind of just nudge the BBC to say, look, you really need to give regard to the identity of the Cornish that has been recognised by the government in your public service broadcast obligation. So it really was just sort of, if you like, laying down a bit of a challenge to the BBC to say, look, how are you representing the Cornish within your public service remit?
It's part of the media bill, currently wending its way through the Lords. The bill is updated regularly to keep in line with developments in broadcasting. Councillor Michael Bunny is from Mebyon Kerno, a political party created to help win greater self-government for the Duchy. He thinks programming should reflect the Cornish language too.
People love Cornish place names, Cornish house names, you know, they're all around us. So I think recognition of the language, and I hope a real positive, inclusive celebration of it as part of our culture and part of our history and heritage. I actually think that's increasing, you know, which is great. It's brilliant.
We're il cafos ag an sueriol splan ag misc honeycomb crunch, praline caramel ag an web, berry.
In 2016, the UK's first advert in Cornish hit our screens. But with only around 1,000 fluent speakers, it's unlikely we'll be seeing Cornish language programming anytime soon. The hope is, though, we'll be watching more shows portraying real life in Cornwall without a pasty or a cream tea in sight. Jeff Moody, GB News.
Yes, and Steve Double MP there complaining about BBC coverage of Cornwall. Maybe he doesn't watch Great British Railway Journeys enough, which certainly always gives a very fair account of Cornwall. Well, in the studio, Ben Leo is here. You're taking over at 1 o'clock.
How are you?
It couldn't be better. Tell me about your programme today.
Yeah, lots going on, not least. So on Friday, Prince Harry, there was rumours from his camp, the Duke of Sussex, that he was going to somehow have a temporary working role back in the royal family despite scuttling off to America 4 years ago. This morning, quite sensationally, the palace have slapped that down. They said there's going to be no reneging on the Queen's wishes, that there's no half-in, half-out agreement. And it begs the question now, did the palace, did King Charles know that Prince Harry was going to be pretty much gobbing off, as some people have said, to American breakfast television, as soon as he'd seen his father for 30 minutes in London?
I was completely puzzled by this because, Prince Harry surely cannot possibly expect to come back, as you say, on that half-back basis. This idea that he would be called up from the reserves because the royal family was short of people of the right age group seemed to be absolutely absurd. I mean, has he no awareness of what he has said about his family over the last 4 years?
What's happened over the last 4 years? I mean, I've been making this point for months. You've had Meghan saying that she wanted to kill herself because she was so terribly treated by the royal family, insinuating that somebody was racist, the institution is racist, all sorts going on, even really personal details in his book, Spare, about Prince William, how he grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and threw him onto a dog bowl in Frogmore Cottage or wherever it was. So it's unbelievable that Harry's train of thought that he thinks he can just waltz back into the fold like that. So, look, a really interesting story, and just amazed, really, how the palace's response, they've really emphatically slapped it down this morning.
It's like that great foot that used to come down in Monty Python with that squishing sound. So the idea of Harry returning to the royal family has been given the big squish by the palace. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. Do you fancy the chance to win £18,000 in our Great British Giveaway? Well, you have to be in it to win it, and here's how you get your entry in.
Still time to turn 2024 into 2020 more with your chance to win £18,000 in cash to spend however you like. You really could be the next big winner of our Great British Giveaway. Phil from West Yorkshire won our last one. Listen to his reaction when we gave him the news.
I never won a penny in my life.
Well, congratulations, you've won £10,000.
Oh my God, wow.
But hurry, for another chance to win £18,000 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB02 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 23rd of February. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Good luck.
Next to Italy, land of the delicious truffle. I'll be joined after the break by a truffle expert to root out why this exclusive and elusive fungus is so highly prized. Join me then.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
When you listen to Nigel Farage's assessment there, do you feel that maybe this is as good as it was going to get, given that we had the pandemic and it was inevitably always going to be a bit of a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's a bit of a poor excuse from Nigel there that they haven't done it properly. The facts are, Nigel, that it's not worked. It's not going to work. Yes, we will rejoin. I mean, are we better off for it? Are they...
Can I jump in there, Charlie? We're going to rejoin under which government? Because Labour aren't going to do that, unless you don't think...
But I mean, it's going to be unavoidable not to join, because I think it's getting worse and worse for us. I mean, let me just say this. Are the NHS better because we're out of Europe? No, they're not, because they're not employing more staff. Is the building trade better off? No. Is travelling abroad or to the EU or staying in the EU, are we better off? No. Are we better off because foods rise because of the EU? No. Are we better off with imports and export? No, because they're taking longer. The overall result is that we're not better off. The killer point here is 57% of the public would now vote to remain. 33% would leave. Surely that's the telling point.
It depends on the pollster, Charlie, because we were talking to a very good pollster earlier who said there's no enthusiasm for any change in a year. Maybe 10 years, they might be thinking about it.
Belinda de Lucia, let's bring you in. I'm sure you want to react to what Charlie said.
I mean, who would have thought that the UK wanting to run its own affairs and making our politicians more accountable would be so revolutionary? EU Parliament voted a majority to get rid of the vetoes, the last remaining scraps of democracy that the EU had. Now, luckily for EU citizens at the moment, you know, it means a treaty change to actually go forward. But that is the mood. The ever closer union. We have dodged a federalised, globalist, international, power-gobbling, anti-democratic organisation, and that's worth more than a few trade and travel perks for a few wealthy people in this country.
Hear, hear. Belinda de Lucia, Charlie Mullins, great to see you both.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. The studio is filled with the heady aroma of fresh truffle. I'm joined by Francesco Di Maddaloni, who finds the finest of these famous fungi in the mountains of northern Italy. They are expensive, exclusive, elusive, and highly prized by chefs around the world. So, Francesco, welcome. What is it that is so highly valued about the truffle?
Well, the first obvious answer is because they're scarce. So it's very rare to find it. The demand is always higher than what we can actually supply. So this makes truffle very costly, rare, and very difficult also to find. So this is the main reason.
I dare not touch it because it's so valuable, but do you mind lifting that truffle up
Absolutely,
so that we can have a good look at it?
And this is the truffle that is in season now, the black winter truffle, which in France they call it Périgord truffle. In Italy, we call it Nero Pregiato. So you can smell the aroma?
I can, but of course, I could smell it long before you put it under my nose because it's a very, very strong aroma.
Yes. And truffle can be used in many different ways. So I'd rather prefer use them in pasta, potato-based or eggs type of dishes because they are quite neutral and let the truffle basically express itself. So
let us say something about how you find them. I've been involved in a truffle hunt, which in the case where I was present involved a dog.
Yeah.
So the dog goes after the truffles because the dog has a very good nose, finds these things which are subterranean. The dog begins to dig them up, and then you have to stop the dog.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the dog will eat it.
Well, it really depends how you train the dog.
Yes.
Yeah, for the dog, it's a kind of game. So you start training the dog when they're really small, puppies, and you actually tell them to find a ball. So you use a kind of essence of truffle into something that you can hide under the ground, and they will smell it. So until then, you go and bring them into woods, forest, basically under oaks, where the truffle grows naturally. So they will smell it, they will dig, and then, of course, dogs make the difference on the way that truffle hunters can actually supply truffles to the market.
It's like a shepherd and the dog. I mean, it's a fantastic relationship between the dog owner and the dog and the truffle hunt. And then, of course, the dog has to be given some reward for giving up the truffle.
Always, always. So the truffle hunter and the dog are really bonded together.
Yeah.
There is this trust, this love. Of course, from the human side, the dog is extremely important because it's a vehicle to make profit. Truffle are very, very expensive. A good dog can worth, I don't know how much in the market, but a lot.
Let's look at some of the things that you brought in here. So you brought a number of things which are not related to truffle in themselves. Why have you brought the things that you have brought?
Well, those are actually all related with truffle. So truffle comes in its natural form as the fresh one, but from the fresh one you can make different type of product. Truffle salt, truffle oil, different truffle paste, truffle butter. So this is something that we use in our small independent company. Truffle salami. So everything is based on truffle.
Oh, you mean that salami's got truffle inside?
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, well, let's start there. Let me start. Right. Oh, sorry.
Let's go.
Actually, let's start here.
Let's start with a drink.
What are we drinking with truffle?
So, this is a very good question, yeah? So the combination between wine and truffle needs a PhD, I believe. It's ongoing history about and debate about what is the best wine for truffle, because you don't want to cover the aroma of truffle and the taste of truffle. So I always recommend to go with a light red or a dry, not fruity white wine.
Right.
So this is a Pinot Noir, for example, which goes really well with truffle.
Let's try this lovely. Cheers to you, Francesco. Thanks for being here.
Big pleasure.
Oh, yeah, the salami has a very distinct taste of truffle. It's a very expensive thing of truffle, but of course it goes a long way, doesn't it? I mean, a tiny sliver of truffle.
Yeah, this is something that I'm going to show you in a second. Let's say I really love fresh truffle with a simply dish like burrata. Yeah, so you have this wonderful burrata.
Oh,
which
look how fresh and beautiful and liquid that is.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to put some, of course, truffle oil, which just a tiny bit on top. Yeah. Again, you can use some truffle salt, which is always good for accompany any dish you have. And here comes the best part of it. So a fresh nero pregiato, so perigo truffle shaved on top.
Are you sure you're willing to do this? You're about to commit, I don't know, hundreds of pounds worth of damage.
No worries at all. So
oh my goodness.
Why not?
Oh, you're being very generous.
So this is how you actually can, have a nice.
That is fantastic. But you really have been generous there.
Yeah.
That's going to give us a very strong taste. How do you recommend eating that, by the way?
So, well, of course, you need a fork and knife and toast bread, and a little bit of burrata on top with the fresh truffle and olive oil would be absolutely fine.
I think I might take this little bit of bread here.
Yes, just take it there, which is much, much simpler.
And I might transfer there.
Absolutely.
Some burrata, some truffle oil, some truffle salt, and a little slice of truffle.
Absolutely, simple like that. Yeah, simple is always the best for truffle. So keep it simple, because you want to feel it. Yeah, you want to taste the aroma, and truffle are very delicate.
That is outstanding. You can't farm truffle.
Well, you can. This is why new countries have become very permanent in the market at the moment. Australia, for example, is a big exporter of truffle, which many is farmed. You can farm easily the black truffles. So you need to know that black truffle is just not one. We have different type of black truffles during the season. Now is not the season. The season ended for the precious white truffle, so which goes basically from October until the end of December. And now is the time for the black winter truffle, so the Perigord truffle or Nero Pregiato, which goes from January to March. But during the season, you have different type of truffle. In autumn, you have the black autumn truffle. In summer, you have the black summer truffle. And those type of truffle fetches different prices in the market.
Do you value one above another?
Well, this black truffle is the best among the other type of black truffles. And then, of course, you have the precious white truffle. Yeah? The white truffle is the most expensive in the market.
Of course.
It is the only one that is very difficult to farm. That is why also it's very, very rare and it's very expensive.
And are you like a sommelier of truffle? Do you have a highly developed palate?
Yes, well, I can recognize what is good and what is not. And this is why countries like Italy or France are the best for truffles. So the type of soil, the humidity, the temperature, the condition, the environmental condition makes the truffle different from one country to another. You can feel the difference between what is premium and what is not. Lots of truffle came from China, for example, but they taste different.
And some viewers will never have tasted truffle, they'll be a bit nervous about it. So if you go into a restaurant and the waiter very kindly says to you, now we could give you some truffle on this, what kind of price are you going to be talking about once they start putting some truffle onto your spaghetti?
The first question that you should ask the waiter, which type of truffle are we talking about? Is this a black winter truffle, which is the most expensive? Is a black summer truffle, which is the cheapest one? And then we can talk about, I don't know, yeah, for example, a spaghetti, a linguine with the white truffle, tagliatelle with the white truffle can fetch market of £50 per dish.
For the dish?
For the dish.
Right. So be careful when you go to a restaurant and they offer you a truffle. Make sure you know what it's going to cost before you order it. Francesco, thank you so much for bringing these delicious truffles. People backstage will be just longing to get to grips with this now. Well, that, unfortunately, is the end of this edition of Sunday with Mike Portillo. I'd like to thank all of my guests and all of my viewers for joining me this Sunday morning and early afternoon. I will be back at 11 o'clock next Sunday, and I very much hope that I'll be seeing you again then. Francesco.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, I'm Marco Petagna. Here's your latest weather update from the Met Office. We hold on to unsettled weather across the UK over the next few days, all seeing some rain at times, but staying mild for the time being at least. This weather front's pushed outbreaks of rain away from the southeast of England during the course of the afternoon, so we've got a ridge of high pressure building in from the west, quietening things down for the overnight period, but further rain's gathering out towards the west, and that will move in across the far northwest of the UK as we head into the overnight period. Elsewhere though, showers will tend to ease through the evening. We'll see lots of clear weather, turning quite misty though, with some fog patches across parts of Wales and the southwest of England during the early hours. Following on from that rain band, we'll see showers turning quite blustery there towards the far northwest by the morning. Quite a mild night, temperatures down to 4 or 5 degrees across rural parts of Scotland, but elsewhere holding up in the high single figures. As for Monday, well, outbreaks of rain continue their journey southeastwards across England and Wales, weakening all the while, so giving some patchy rain across the far southeast into the afternoon. Elsewhere, it's a day of sunshine with a few showers around, those showers quite blustery towards the north and west of Scotland. But once again, it's a mild day for the time of year. Temperatures mostly in double figures,